Biology of consciousness. We had a very big week last week. We discussed mathematics, especially mathematical logic. So today I will take it easier on you. This will be an in-between week. We will discuss still perception and cognition. So there is a strong emphasis yet again on neuroscience, neurobiology. We'll talk about some of the theories and some of the research studies in this field. But this is also an in-between week. It's a break week. It's a shorter lecture than usual because it is a bridge toward week 13. Now, I did already introduce you at this point to both the theory, the mathematical background, the scientific proof and demonstration of multiple models of consciousness. But next week, I will present to you my own model, the triple S model of consciousness, and we will see how that applies to other forms of investigations. So it is not necessarily an easy week per se, but it's a week that should give you some chance of taking a deep breath and decide how to move on toward the very last portion of the semester, because week 14 and week 15 are approaching, and you will need to have enough time to work on your final paper. I also encourage you to meditate on your final paper because I want you to enjoy the process. Is this everything we discussed in the class? Is there more that we will encounter next week? Yes, of course, there is. But at the same time, I want to give you the chance to ponder what really stimulates your knowledge. Last week, we discussed both intelligence and the mathematical framework to better understand consciousness. So today, there are a few topics that I would like to bring to your attention. And I will move right here to read them from you. So we will talk about psychons. We will talking about metaphysical consideration, cognitocentrism and pragmacentrism. We will also work on some of the standard psychological frameworks. So we talk about Vygotsky, we're talking about Bandura. We'll talk about love and will, free will again, it's an essential component to neuroscience. And then we will continue with some element of neuroimaging, neuroinformatics to be prepared for those branches of investigations that will cover things such as artificial intelligence, transhumanism, brain-computer interface, and all those questions. Now, before I show you the slides, or rather the videos, I want to congratulate you on the hard work you put in for these first 12 weeks. And also, I want to express my appreciation for the very insightful conversation I had with many of you via email, especially in the context of the social dimension of what we're studying this semester. I was very pleased to hear that many of you decided to either have a career change or a awareness of a different direction you want to take in your life, and that the fact that this course helped you navigate some of those curiosities, for lack of better terms. And I also appreciate how some of you reached out to me in the context of how this type of knowledge impacts our current educational system, especially in the United States. Now, I have few new lectures coming up next semester, some of which will be part of a brand new course, but also some of them will be part of a series of interviews that I will be doing with colleagues and research team members that will target specifically some of the questions that you have asked. So there's more to come. Now, if you're not enrolled or you're not, you completed your academic path and you're ready, will be awarded a degree next year, no problems. Those interviews, those parts of lecture will be still posted on YouTube. and you'll be able to access them regardless if you're a student or not. But I just want to let you know how much I appreciate your feedback so far. All right, enough about the follow-up next semester. Let's go straight to this week's topic.
We will continue our discussion on the mind-body problem from a general overview perspective. We will also continue with perceiving, seeing, evidencing, and understanding. And the subfields of neuroscience that we will examine this week will be cognitive neuroscience, computational neuroscience, sensory neuroscience and theory of perception, system neuroscience, neuroinformatics, neuroimaging, and neurophysics. Now, let's begin by reviewing what we said last week about the origins of the neuroscientific approach toward the mind-body connection. And one of the names that you might have remembered from previous lectures is the one by John Eccles, the famous neurophysiologist, the Australian neurophysiologist, who analyzed this problem starting from the criticism, not necessarily in a negative sense, of the consideration presented by Karl Popper. Now, some of the most important aspects of Eccles' thesis are developing collaboration with Friedrich Beck. So, to identify the concept of a mind trigger movement that acts upon the brain via the activation of cortical dendrons, more specifically, dendrons in the 6 laminae of the cerebral cortex, which are in turn connected to psychons. What do we mean by psychons? Well, psychons define a unitary conscious experience that elicits an electrochemical neural response under the laws of quantum mechanics. Again, in this chapter, we are really trying to combine what we gather from the empirical evidence to the application of theoretical methods to make sure that we don't miss important aspects in these equations. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it's connected with the concept of free will due to the activation of dendrons by psychons happening in willed actions and thoughts. Now, what do we mean by willed action and thoughts? This is connected to the concept of will, free will, volition, as well as connection to a higher meaning, as we will see shortly after. So will as connected to what we said earlier about the new man of the spirit, so the cortex, the prefrontal cortex particularly, as opposed to the old man of the flesh. So spirit as intellectual ability, intellectual strength, and so will as power to reason, to understand, to perceive, to act upon certain circumstances. So, since this activation of dendrons by psychons happens in willed action and thoughts, this increases the probability of action potential in specific neurons through quantum tunneling effect in synaptic exocytosis. Now, Eccles also theorizes that the opposite of what we just said, in a reverse process, is in place when we're dealing with perception instead of will cognition. Some similarities, not necessarily in the quantum mechanic-based explanation of the neural processes, but on the primacy of mind, are found in the work by Pascal Michael and Vincent Torley. Now, one thing that I want to stress here is this theoretical transcendental approach, because the issue is not just that the West, particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, the Western scientific enterprise, the Western medical establishment, it's not only ethnocentric. We talked about the Nasirema, right, last week, and problems with bias and racism, intrinsic mislabeling, misunderstanding, forced diagnosis that we witness in the West. So this is not only an ethnocentric problem, but it's also cognicentric or pragmacentric, terms that Stanislav Grof coined in 1998, in a sense that we interpret science, the whole of human existence, only from a utilitarian/utilitarianistic materialist perspective, because we ought to do something with it. This will not be in itself problematic, but it's dangerous if we start to believe that that's all there is, that the whole ultimate purpose and meaning of life is productivity. So in this sense, I dare to say that it's a representation of extremes on both the left and right political spectrum. The extremist view within communism, extremist views within capitalism, because they're both materialist base, both focus on this never-ending progress that is synonymous with materialist technological advance without any focus on metaphysical, transcendental, or ethical factors. All right, so since we talked about the connection between science, perception, and the psychological, social, and political um, areas, what about these social cognitive theories, zone of proximal development, ZPD, the developmental aspects? Well, Vygotsky in '62 offered a similar view in writing that inner speech is speech for oneself, external speech is speech for others. So this is again important for recognizing ourselves in the other person. That's a transcendental as well as social perspective, a perspective that includes the broadest possible area of perception. Also, from I dare to say, a mystical and theological standpoint. Mentioning the word by Vladimir Lossky in the mystical theology, he mentioned the importance of understanding the difference between what we can and we should approach with our senses and our man-made technologies and what it's given to us, I dare to say, in a mystical, divine, transcendental sense, and even as a revelation, if you see the quote by Lossky, right, in regard to the Trinity. This revelation that is something that it's revealed to us. It's not discovered by us, despite the fact that this veil, the veil, is present in both cases. Discovering, you remove the cover, and revelation, you remove the veil, or something is unveiled toward you. Now, of course, in Lossky's view, and in classical Christian orthodoxy, theosis is indicated by this process. Theosis, this divinization, which is not something we do, it's what we become, becoming God-like. Theosis is above human knowledge. And so while it's important to maintain solid scientific evidence and solid scientific method in understanding matter, our perception, our knowledge, it's only a minor portion of what the truth ultimately is. Theosis is above that type of knowledge. Now, so on one side, you have experimentation, empirical evidence, laboratory science, and on the opposite side, you find what is the mystical as well as the postmodernist approach, according to Sheff in 1992, where one understands something and then tries to get an idea about it, which is quite interesting because in the scientific method, we mentioned this multiple times in regard to the principle of falsifiability and the hypothesis testing. You first come out with a hypothesis, and then you test to verify whether the hypothesis makes sense at least, or is ultimately true, right? 0 and 1. In this context, it's the opposite. It's given to us. It's a gift. You understand something, I dare to say intuitively to some extent, because intuitively, from the Latin intueor, has to do with going inside, moving inside, perceiving inside. So there's some sort of movement, and the movement is not active, of course, something we receive. So it's perceptual, it's passive, it's introspective in a sense that is receiving. Okay? And the other aspect is that it's a very subjective experience that has to do with, again, mystical states, to a very big extent, to states that we could compare to the ones of prophets, right? So people that, or enlightened being, right? Because the first person experience is very difficult to replicate, scientifically speaking. It's also, in general terms, it's very difficult to understand from the outside. What does it mean to be me? How would you know what it means to be me? How can you fit my shoes, to speak? How can you understand my perspective? So this is what we strive for, and yet we struggle with using only materialistic scientific method. And then another question remains on the level of the identification of where the process actually is. If let's assume that there is a way to indicate where the perception as a thing in itself and the human experience based on bones and blood and muscles and my ultimately body entity, my incarnation. Where does it happen? Well, this is similar to the discussion we had about the card and the master gland, right? So the master gland has the pituitary gland, of course, connected to the thalamocortical activation, the hormonal regulation, and the intersection between endocrine and nervous system, as well as the pineal gland, which, according to Descartes, was a seat of the human soul. And we could even analyze this twilight zone, right? When we have hypnagogic and hypnopompic states between wakeful states and sleep states, and how can we use a computational and how can analyze those states if we want to verify whether soul incarnates, so to speak, within our body? Well, we could examine sleep patterns, for instance, via wave analysis, REM states, circadian rhythm, or external influences from pharmacological interventions. But at the same time, we will miss, the portion of neural underpinning and localization where we have, a left side and a right side, a left and right hemisphere presentation of such perceptual movement. And this perceptual movement has to do with things that we can recognize over time. Now, this chapter is about perception, cognition, understanding. And so this recognition, this understanding, is a recognition and understanding that happens right here, right now, through space and time. It has to do with the recognition of the self, with the ability of human beings to recognize themselves as themselves by looking back and creating hypotheses and envisioning a possible future. Interestingly enough, in connection to what we said about the principle of will, right, this willful presence, the free will and free want, will in itself has to do with volitional processes. And this volition is reenacting, making a future possible by virtue of combining the being and becoming. Okay, so being and becoming. Since we talk about language, is quite interesting. This being and becoming is connected to both sides of a ancient Indo-European culture. So you have Slavic languages where the verb budit means to become. Budi dobar, be a good person, dobar čovjek. Buditi as in manifesting ourselves outwardly. Budi as presenting a mode of being oriented toward a future, becoming. The same term budit, it's found in Buddha. And the Buddha, according to Buddhist teaching, of course, the enlightened one, the person who becomes his true self, so to speak. This is fascinating from a linguistic perspective, and it's also making a lot of sense if we analyze the theology of Buddhist teaching, because in this teaching, mind and body are separated but connected, interdependent and mutually supporting one another, metaphorically leaning against one another. So this element of a hug, of a embrace, is quite present. Now, according to the Buddha, our mind is flowing like a river or a stream, and it's constantly manifesting the 5 aggregates of Buddhist teaching. What are these 5 aggregates? Well, there are material form, feelings, perception, volition, and sensory consciousness. Now, this volition has to do with this will in a higher sense, okay? Will as in acting and reenacting, activating, manifesting the highest good as opposed to evil. So in the Bible, you find terms such as people of good will. So it's not just a will in terms of a forced emphasis on control. It's not the Triumph des Willens, that had unfortunate memories within Nazi Germany of the 30s and 40s. It's the will as will to reach out, to become, to be enlightened, to love even. And that's another connection with Slavic languages. Think about voliti in southern Slavic languages, such as the Serbo-Croatian continuum, so Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, as well as Montenegrin, and to some minor extent, Macedonian as well as Slovenian, where voliti means to love, although it's connected to volition, volere in Latin, to will, to wish even, okay? And the opposite, ljubiti, ljubav, has to do with the connection to kissing, to a different form of love, etymologically connected to Liebe in German, or love in English. But the idea of volition to create this connection to the other side of us, recognizing ourselves in the other person, what we said about Emmanuel Levinas and the other, it's quite fascinating in Buddhist teaching as well. Now, these 5 aggregates are influenced by the 5 causal laws. So biological laws, psychological laws, physical laws, volitional laws, and universal laws. It's fascinating because the view of the mind-body problem, including the fact that the universe is ever morphing, okay, is at the basis of Buddhist meditation and mindfulness practice. So we mentioned Indo-European culture, we mentioned Buddhism, we mentioned Slavic culture, and we mentioned Germanic and Italic culture as well. And so those practices, these mindfulness practices, are very similar to what we would define as unio mystica, or mystical union in the Catholic and Orthodox form of prayer, okay, or of the Satori or Kensho of the Zen tradition, or to remain in the India subcontinent, to the Nirvana. So one of the things that are fascinating is to study the mind-body problem and recognize how many of these similarities are there. And the further back we go in time, whether we want to use a simple linguistic approach, or anthropological approach, or archaeological approach, becomes more and more evident. Now, of course, there are some negative aspects of this as well, particularly in the caricaturesque form that some of these older spiritual traditions, so older in comparison to the 3 modern religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, present. And this is the case of Nova Religio Romana, the neo-paganism, Ronovierie, Asatru, which are in themselves, interestingly enough, very important for the perspective of archaeological, anthropological reconstruction, but at the same time they become caricaturesque because they claim to be the continuation of a sequence, of a line of knowledge that was never forgotten. And to some extent, the claim is the same one that you can find in perennial philosophy, but the point is that it's a reconstruction. So something along the lines has been broken, or rather, it's not about being broken, but it's about being transformed, because the identity of these spiritual manifestations, by definition, are archetypes, and so they can take on different shapes in order to readapt themselves. They don't readapt themselves in order to survive in the specific social context, but they are creating the social context to a very big extent. So neo-paganism is a contradiction in term, first of all, because the term pagan comes from the Latin paganus, which is in modern Italians paesano, which has to do with folksman, or person from the same rural town, but with a negative of the term. This was for sure utilized in the first centuries of the Judeo-Christian tradition first, and then the Islamic tradition as well, to define people that lived in the non-urban areas, and that's why they were rural, in the Rus, right? And the Rus, as intended in this bucolic sense, the countryside, not the Rus in the Ugro-Finnic or Germanic term, the people of the Ruotsin, in that sense. People that were therefore backwards and still believed in the old gods, in the old spirits. It was a negative term, not because pagus, paganus, as translation for little town, rural area, was intrinsically bad, because it was utilized as a negative version of rural people with no knowledge, no education, even rednecks, we could say, backwards, obscurantist people. And this is something that was added much later. It's not intrinsic to the value, and by definition, it's also contradictory of what the unity of those practices were all about. Plus, uniting all paganism as if it was one single religion, this will also be a mistake, despite the fact that the similarities are more coherent rather than the opposite. Now, what about going back to the ancient times, the pre-monotheistic times? And by the way, this does not mean that this form of paganism could not have been filtered through monotheistic themes, because, the people of the sea, the Phoenicians as well, the culture of Canaan and so on and so forth, were themselves morphed and readapted, not repressed, but readapted, reincorporated. And so this is something that that since the beginning of time was the case. But what about the theoretical approach of this ideal? So mind and body as the perception of something that happens in this world, the body, but it also has a deeper form of essence. Deeper form of essence, it's something that in Greek philosophy, think about Plato, had to do with this veil. Okay, so in a matter-based experience, this world, right? But something that is connected to something transcendental. So to go back to Buddhist meditation or meditation in general, what happens when we meditate? Well, when we meditate, there's a parachronistic moment, a moment outside of time and space, of eternal presence. This moment is achieved by removing the external shells of the ego, and I'm using ego here in somewhat imprecise version, a version that has to do with westernized application of pseudo-Freudian psychoanalysis, where the ego was not considered a bad thing, but keep in mind that ego is simply the first person pronoun in Latin, so it's equivalent to I or ich or yo or ja, etc., as in Bulgarian. So you meditate, you remove these external shell of the ego, and this constructed self disappears, and we can get rid of unnecessary illusions, or delusion, I dare to say, because in Italic languages, the term for illusion is actually delusione. And by getting rid of these layers, we get rid of the thing that trapped us in the material world. We get rid of this veil of Maya that prevents us from seeing clarity, seeing clearly. Okay. Now we are trapped in a sense that we are free, not because we do not recognize the essence of the body. We are, as many people have said before me, spiritual being making an earthly or chthonic experience, but because this earthly element is the one that allows us to navigate the experience itself. It's like getting rid of a car if you want to be free to walk around, but approaching the car as a container, as a boundary that allows you to go from point A to point B. So this veil of Maya that we're getting rid of, it's connected to the shadow or the shell, to the doppelganger, to this element discussed in Plato that thought that primary forms give rise to material objects, giving them shape and meaning. But they also, these primary forms also give identity, purpose, structure, and function. So everything we perceive, and keep this in mind because that's what we base our current scientific knowledge upon, things we can perceive either with our senses or with our technology. Nothing else is important, really, okay? So everything material we perceive is actually just a shadow of something deeper. So we're actually investigating things that are not as important as the external shell. So this will be connected to the immortal world of forms, the immortal forms or ideas, which is a concept at the center of the Greco-Roman culture, in itself influencing the later development of Semitic culture as well, although with a solid presence in early Islamic philosophy, Zoroastrianism, Sufi mysticism, Gnosticism, etc., etc. Although within Gnosticism, and to some extent, Bogomilism and some theories within the Cathars, the emphasis of the negativity, the intrinsic evil of the material form of the world itself, of matter, of nature, it's something that it's not coherent to this view. The world is not to be rejected as intrinsically bad. It's simply to be put at a proper distance so it doesn't swallow us alive. We are, in other words, we're not of this world. We're simply in this world. Okay. Now, okay. So if you're in this world, since we're talking about mind-body connection, is the soul separate from the body as in eternal, since the body is doomed to have biological decay, or not? Well, if you want to be coherent and reading through this idea, in the Phaedo, Socrates pointed out that A, there is a separation between between body and soul, B, the soul is indeed immortal, and C, there is an afterlife. So this is something that was coherent in the ancient world, expected to be the case with some translation different modalities, but there was no doubt that life in itself did not end with material decay. There were some elements of philosophy which we discussed in week 5 that we would quantify nowadays as either skeptical, agnostic, or atheist, depending where which you put the attention on. But nevertheless, in the ancient world, this was definitely the most important way to approach reality. Now, does Socrates provide evidence for this? Well, he has 4 main arguments to defend that. The first one is the cyclical argument, or the opposites argument. The second one is the theory of recollection. Then you have the affinity argument, and then the final argument from form of life. Now, to be more specific, the eternity and unchangeableness of forms is explained in the first argument as basis for the 2 poles, body versus soul. By theory of recollection, Socrates identified a different form of knowledge we can obtain from the information the soul carries before physical birth. So again, contrary to physical experience, contrary to perceptual modalities based on our senses or our technologies, even before we are born. The affinity argument, instead, focuses on the external manifestation of body versus soul. In the first case, we are talking about perceivable, moral, material elements. In the second case, we define the soul as the opposite of all of this, and as such, a soul as able to continue life after physical death. The very last one, the final arguments, defines the causal element of all the things we perceive. In other words, the forms are true reality, both incorporeal and static, in which all material things participate. How about Aristotle, since we talked about Aristotle multiple times here? Well, Aristotle's ideas are slightly different. So he viewed mind as a faculty of the soul. Thus, mind and body are 2 aspects of the same thing, which again brings us back to Vladimir Lossky and the idea of the Trinitarian approach, right? So the same way as God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit are 3 entities, we could say, with an ontological sense. We could use the metaphor of gold. Gold can be a golden ring. Gold can be, metaphorically speaking, a golden sunset or sunrise, or can be a golden leaf used in fine arts, etc., etc., etc. So mind and body are as 2 aspects of the same thing, okay? And a metaphor that's coherent with Aristotle would be the metaphor indicating a connection between the shape of a physical object and the object itself. Other philosophers that you might want to read about in the textbooks are Leucippus, Democritus, Lucretius, and their approach regarding the universe as actually composed by being and void, so made up by atoms, these invisible particles. Now, other philosophers that are cited in this chapter, in contrast sometimes to this metaphysical transcendental element, are Daniel Dennett. We mentioned his name when we talked about free will and the Libet experiment. Nordhoff, in regard to compatibility of mental causation with classical, formal, and final causality. Celia Green in the context of interactionism. David Ray Griffin with pan-experientialism. John Searle in terms of the false dichotomy of the mind-body problem. Alfred North Whitehead with panpsychism, Walter Freeman with circular causation over linear causation, and Ryle with the specific criticism of the Cartesian-based ghost in the machine, something that you probably heard multiple times before. And again, for a full review of the possibilities that the dualism, epiphenomenalism, psychophysics parallelism, and non-reducing physicalism, you could also refer to the central part of this chapter and table 4 with the model proposed by Baxter. Again, this relates to what we said in previous week about the connection between science, society, identity, perception, sense of belonging. And I want to quote Stanislav Grof again. He wrote that according to the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm of traditional Western science, the restrictions and limitations in regard to human perception are absolutely mandatory and definitive, since they result from the material nature of the world and are determined by physiological laws of perception. However, Modern consciousness research has clearly demonstrated that in transpersonal experiences, this limitation, again, the limitation of physical, material nature, do not apply and can be transcended. This represents a critical challenge not only for psychiatry and psychology, and in our field, of course, neuroscience, but for the entire philosophy of Western science. Now, of course, Western science specifically understood as Western Anglo-Saxon model, a science that forgot or at least does not want to remember where it came from after the age of industrial revolution, after the age of enlightenment, after the age of artificial forced separation between empiricism, evidence-based science, and transcendental factors. This is connected to understanding structure and function of what mind actually is, to hylomorphism in the version by Jaworski, as well in understanding what rational physical phenomena are in general. And I want to quote Anspacher here from Quantum Approaches to Consciousness from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Anspacher in 2015 wrote, "One rationale for the focus on psychological phenomena is that their detailed study is a necessary precondition for further questions as to their neural correlates. Therefore, the investigation of mental quantum feature resists the temptation to reduce them all too quickly to neural activity. There are several kinds of psychological phenomena which have been addressed in the spirit of mental quantum features so far. Decision processes, order effects, bistable perception, learning, agency, semantic networks, and superquantum entanglement correlations." So again, our current materialist paradigm no longer is sufficient to describe the mind-body connections. And there are multiple other models of consciousness that go beyond that. At this point, old school surpassed, I dare to say, superstitious materialist view. Other models of consciousness include, they're not all of them, but I think the list presented in this chapter, it's quite comprehensive, the most common ones. So everything we're saying here is connected to society. We're not talking about the neural underpinnings of behavior and a connection between critical neuroscience and philosophy toward perception, just to provide more theoretical precision. No, because this has a strong impact in the way we perceive the world as a whole, in the way we interpret moral decision making in order to interpret our values. In this chapter, toward the end of the chapter, before we discuss other subfields in neuroscience, I mentioned a few cases within biomedical ethics that were really, really tragic. I mentioned the one by Michael Farley, the one by Terry Schindler-Schiavo, the one by Jahim Macmeth, and many, many others to provide some elements of discussion. But again, it's really important to understand this is not just theoretical speculation, it has an intrinsic value. Wonderful. In the very last part of this chapter, we talk about certain subfields within neuroscience, and then we will conclude. Let's start with cognitive neuroscience. Now, cognitive neuroscience has to do with cognition and with attention, of course. And there are multiple approaches that I think we should at least mention. The localizationist view, the one by John Huggins Jackson, the aggregate field view with Pierre Florent, and many, many others. Now, in the first case, this view attempted to connect cognitive abilities to specific areas in the brain, first in the cortical and subcortical areas, then in the limbic system. The second view, the aggregate field view, promoted a more cooperative activity, a more integrated activity in the brain as primary cause for specific mental functions, specifically in the case of cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and brainstem. And this has to do with the neuron doctrine, the complete mapping on the brain, and all the historical names of neuroscience: Wernicke, Angelo Mosso, Gustav Reich, Corbinian-Brodmann, Broca, Hitzig, so on and so forth. Now, in more modern sense, also thanks to MRI, fMRI, SPECT, and PET, PET scans, some of the focus has been progressively moving on, especially with Marr and Neisser and Miller, to the classic 3 levels of neuroscientific analysis. More specifically, at least this is the view by David Marr, the computational, the algorithm representational, and the physical. Now, this is a framework that still it's dominating in cognitive neuroscientists, right? Now, computational neuroscience is connected to it. It's a very theoretical neuroscience, and determining the hypothesis that neural mental activity is a question of quantity and therefore of computation. So the focus of cognitive neuroscience is primarily on the biology, function, and activity process of neuron and neural systems. So it uses a real and model-based computational system to create theoretical hypotheses, which can in turn be tested using, as you probably suspect, laboratory experiments with the help of biology and psychology. To give you a few examples, frontal and parietal lobes are analyzed as brain integrators for the data coming via multiple sensory processes, and are investigated with the help of animal models, particularly in single-unit recording in primates. Animal models are very important to test the disorder at the intersection of psychiatry and neurology, or to debate the possible application of computational approaches of consciousness, for instance, in the work by Crick and Koch on neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. Modeling and simulations as simulations are the center of integrated neuroscience-based investigation of neural processes and the concept of intelligent machines as the descriptor of biological structures, and theoretical models for the analysis of decision-making processes such as neural modeling or the computational representational understanding of mind, or CRUM. So if you want to sum up what is computational neuroscience, well, it's a hybrid field that also comprises mathematical descriptors to investigate the properties of specific cells in the nervous system and the generation of action potential across the membrane. Now, the biological neural models, Spaky neural model, subdividing electron input-output membrane voltage models, and natural pharmacological input neural models are just a few of these models. Now, since we're talking about attention, learning, and memories, there are models that are very, very popular, the one by Hebb and Hopfield, and models that understand how these processes constantly morph, strengthen, and rearrange according to the 2 basic types of synaptic plasticity, so intrinsic homosynaptic and extrinsic heterosynaptics. Now, from the viewpoint of computational neuroscience, multiple time scales functionality is a very interesting aspect of this type of plasticity, especially in the context of neurophysiological memory analysis. This approach, in fact, provides new insight on the quantitative impact of changes in synaptic transmission elicited by external stimuli. Problems, issues, well, there are very many unanswered questions, such as one pertaining to the lack of detailed information, how low connectivity areas in comparison to the site-specific neural networks found throughout the brain and appear very complex and yet very organized, at least at the level of biological neurons, but less specific in their artificial counterparts. So there's always this issue between the two. So think about artificial models like Genesis or Neurons, software platform, the McCullough-Pitts model, other models of neural network activities, and the fact that the activity depends on specific computational functions and geometric structures or properties at the level of neuronal cells, axons, and dendrites. This is also connected to what we said a few weeks ago about microtubules, but also in a broader sense in terms of neurons, interaction, and networks. Now, sensory neuroscience and theory of perception. In this chapter, we cannot spend too much time on any of this because you could have a full textbook only about theory of perception. But for now, keep in mind that sensory neuroscience targets the physiological, anatomical aspect of perception, particularly the audiovisual olfactory system, while theory of perception investigates, as the name implies, theoretical underpinnings. This is, again, connected to consciousness understanding or understanding consciousness. Think about Kant's theory of pure understanding. Now, understanding consciousness in itself is a Hegelian term, as a mind's own image of itself, so seeing itself as a unifying principle and omnicomprehensive greater self. Okay, but this is connected to the way we interpret full consciousness, full awareness. Also, unhappy consciousness connect to melancholia and depression. So what we said earlier about the missing perceptual abilities that might be cause for certain mental health issues. Now, if the theory of Kant is guilty of missing the mark of realism, which is fundamental in the context of sensory neuroscience, which is based on senses, this type of consciousness is linked to a real person evolving sub-moments that's drawing ontological elements from philosophical tradition predating Kantian speculation. To review some of the basic elements of sensory neuroscience and perception, there are terms such as extra or exterior reception or sensory perception, which have to do with the information provided by the external world through our senses, external perception. So there are two main directions and two main processes underlying perception. We have afferent and afferent directions. So the first one, A, together with the E, so from ad fero in Latin or ex fero in Latin. So they have afferent and afferent neurons. The first one with the A responsible for the delivery of nerve impulses from the sensory stimuli toward the CNS, and the latter with the E responsible for carrying inputs from the CNS to the muscle, so motor neurons. Now, in neuroanatomical terms, afferent neurons with the A enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root, while afferent neurons with the E exit the spinal root from the ventral root. The two processes instead are the processing sensory input, responsible for transforming low level to higher level information at the subconscious or at least pre-conscious level awareness, and the cognitive autonomic process connected to representation, expectations, and selection. Now, what about experimentations? Well, in sensory neuroscience, you study spike shapes, frequencies, for instance, with post-stimulus time histograms, time, especially latency between stimulus and the effect, and patterns in response to a single stimulus or a set of stimuli. An approach which is similar to behaviorist investigation in the context of conditioning, although with techniques such as electroencephalography, electrophysiology, or fMRI. Now, in the case of an observation of a single neuron, the experimenter will isolate a neuron on the basis of the stimulus it reacts to in the form of an actual potential. It is then important to understand that spiking patterns might actually react to more than one stimulus, they respond to more than one stimulus, and then the experiment will have to be conducted over time and following the patterns around to precisely monitor neural variability. Now, following the patterns around is exactly what we talked about last week in the context of logical mathematics, mathematical logic, right? That's recognition of patterns. Now, this approach, together with linear regression, will allow a very accurate image of the neuron spatiotemporal receptive field and thereby account for excitation and depression processes in the neurons. The field of systems neuroscience is responsible for the study of neural circuits, networks, and systems, including the associative circuit, the limbic circuit, and the motor circuit. Now, the focus of system neuroscience is on the connection between internal and external environment, between the subject and their world, and between molecular and cellular approaches as biological underpinnings for higher functions, including cognitive and rationalization processes, understanding, language, communication, emotion, memory, as well as the previously mentioned fields of awareness/consciousness. Now, this is also held through the field of neuroinformatics, the development of theoretical frameworks and databases for the collection, investigation, and storage and sharing of information on the nervous system, and also to ameliorate computational modeling features for brain-computer interfaces, and cellular, cognitive, molecular data, as well as for the purpose of discussing and describing developmental, disease-related neurobiological information and artificial neuroengineering data. Now, in the case of information gathered via neurons and neural networks, the main focus covers cortical and subcortical areas, especially sensory-related areas linked to visual, auditory, taste, hearing, and olfactory system, organizing neuroinformatics maps and atlases to foster precise classification and averaging standardization. However, neuroinformatics can also draw information from the analysis of neurotransmission as in action potential and channels, as well as neural and protein pathways to better understand physical and emotional pain, but also behavioral, lifestyle, or genetic disorder with general medical health and mental needs. Neuroinformatics thus investigates aspects of neural cytology and neuronal and motor differentiation, axon guidance, synaptic formation, and growth factors in general, including clinically relevant aspects such as healing processes after injury and cellular tissue regeneration. What is one of the problems within this field? It's the applicability and integration of mathematical models to the biological base of the system investigated, since we're talking about IT-based technology. Now, it will be almost irrelevant to mention another list of technologies, but think about neocortical microcircuit database, or MDB, collecting and editing cellular microstructural data, the web-based digital atlas brain maps, the Center XML Metaformer Brain ML system, the Budapest Reference Connectome, the Human Connectome Project, the Human Brain Project, the GeneWave System, the Biomedical Informatics Research Network BIRN, BIRN, as well as the European Union Office for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Now, since all these fields are by definition integrated, theoretical informatics intersects with the field commonly known as information technology, which in itself is subdivided in graph theory, mathematical logic, type theory, theory of computation, and of course bioinformatics, as you know, moving from theoretical consideration to apply informatics oriented to the demands of clinical care. So collection, categorization, analysis, and storage strategies for biological or medical data. So let's continue with neuroimaging and neurophysics. So by neurophysics, we mean a subfield of physics, of course, more specifically biomedical physics, focused on the application of concept theories, techniques, and technologies on the nervous system to investigate the physical underpinnings of its activity at the cellular, molecular, and system networks level. Neuroimaging, that we mentioned 1,000 times at this point in this course, is one of the most important centers of attention of our analysis, as it provides some of the most relevant techniques to investigate these neural correlates involving cognition, emotion, computation, memory, expression, communication, conscience and consciousness, and many, many others. Now, we are paying our tribute to neuroimaging because of the decade of the brain, the research years comprised between 1999 and 2000, which was interestingly enough followed by the decade of the mind until 2010. So it's interesting because those neural underpinnings did not substitute other types of analysis ultimately, such as the psychological, philosophical, and investigative strategies. The hope of the decade of the brain was a very progressivist / enlightenment scientific hope, right? A positivistic hope that the decade of the brain will explain away everything about human life, human consciousness. This turned out to be not the case at all, despite the fact that we learned a lot of things thanks to these new technologies, starting from the human circulation balance of Angelo Mosso through the ventriculography by Dandy, the subsequent pneumoencephalography or PEG from Moniz, the cerebral angiography or CAG, the computerized axial tomography, the CAT scan by McLeod, Cormack, and Godfrey Newbold Hounsfield, the single photon emission computed tomography or SPECT, the positron emission tomography PET, all the way to the always improving technologies such as magnetic resonance imaging, so MRI, formerly nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy or NMR, and many, many, many others. Now, for the purpose of our analysis, the only one that I want you to review on the textbooks are computed axial tomography, cranial ultrasound, diffuse optical imaging, event-related optical signal, magnetic resonance image, functional magnetic resonance imaging, positron emission tomography, single photon emission computed tomography, and magnetoencephalography. So please review this one in the textbook just to have a solid grasp on what they're doing, and this will provide you with a solid basis for the understanding of the very last chapter of the book. Now, this has all type of connection with the sense of self, as we mentioned in previous chapter. Now, the self as a central element in our analysis, an analysis that is aimed to find ultimate universal truth, something that is to some extent counterintuitive to my recommendations, the recommendation I give to students throughout the course, as in making sure that all our scientific bibliographical references are updated, possibly published in the last 7 years. So don't quote scientific research that is outdated, it's too old, because new research might be available to students. And yet, the most important elements that we need to understand that will be at the basis of next week's discussion are things that are completely detached from current scientific knowledge, not because they go against scientific knowledge, quite the contrary, but because of the premise for scientific knowledge. Since science is also about discovery, you cannot discover things that were not already there, either to say since time immemorial, since the beginning of time. So there are things that are really outside of time and space. Now, think of some of the philosophical aspects here. Zeno Elia, for instance, thought that metaphysical essence of reality was eternal, beyond time, okay? Beyond time in the classical Greek etymology. Think about chronos and aion. Thus, time was itself an opinion, a position of the doxa, imprecise, incomplete truth. This is just an example. And understanding that there are universal truth is exactly the type of focus we need to embrace in order to move from this week, Perception and Cognition, Chapter 6, Part 2, to the very last portion of this semester.
This concludes week 12. So the decade of the brain, decade of the mind, who knows, maybe we will see a decade of the spirit or consciousness in the future, regardless of these catchphrases and bumper sticker definition of consciousness. I do believe that we are witnessing a change in a paradigm, both on a social level, a scientific level, as well as a personal level. And I'm very excited to be, to some extent, part of this, if for no other reason that I am studying these topics to better equip my students with the knowledge necessary to understand consciousness. I will see you all in week 13. As I promised, we will be discussing the triple S model, and we will see how that applies to, at this point, transcendental elements, spiritual elements, and social elements of psychology, consciousness, neuroscience, etc. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.